Look at the Bible with Delaney and Shawn. Delaney has been through a lot of religious instruction, but she really hasn't understood the Bible, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? And so we're just going through different books of the Bible and talking about them. We're in Galatians, chapter 2.
Chapter 2. All right, let's just get into it. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along. Also, I went in response to a revelation, and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running my race in vain. This is Paul, and he's still sort of defending the fact that he's not like responsible to anybody.
He's kind of a rogue.
Yes.
But here he changes a little bit, because in chapter 1, I think he was saying, I didn't consult with anybody except Peter and James.
Yes.
And now he's saying, I brought some brothers with me. And so he's saying, okay, I'm willing to talk, but he's still defending himself.
Yeah, that it was kind of confusing, but
yeah,
we don't have to get into it that much. Paul's just confusing, I guess.
Paul is a confusing man.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask though, who was considered a leader? He went in response to a revelation and meeting privately with those esteemed leaders.
I don't know.
Okay.
They were seen as leaders, so probably, remember, a lot of years have passed since Yeshua ascended into heaven and left the apostles sharing. So there have been people who have come along, elders they called them, and deacons, and who were working in the body of believers at that time, and that must be them.
Okay.
And he said he had a revelation that told him to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
It could be that he's saying like he went and did that after 14 years. Like he spent a long time on his own, and then he did this little thing.
Could be.
But because he continues on, yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. That seemed out of the blue, but...
Well, I think the context is he's going to get into what has happened at the Church of Galatia, and he is mentioning the act of circumcision. So there probably was an argument as to whether Christians should be circumcised.
Okay.
So knowing that he's going to address that, he just throws in here without telling us. And Titus wasn't even circumcised, right? Isn't that what he says?
Yeah. So, yeah, I went in response to a revelation, meeting privately with leaders, presented them the gospel he preached to Gentiles. I'm assuming the leaders were Jewish leaders then, because he's presenting them the gospel.
No, I would say they could have been Jewish leaders, but not exclusively. What's interesting is he's saying, I presented the gospel to the leaders. So the leaders know the gospel.
Okay.
But it's the gospel to the Gentiles, which is very different, and people don't get that.
The gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. That's a different gospel.
There's a distinction there. Yeah.
Okay.
And even readers of the Bible today, they don't get that. So they constantly make mistakes of what Jesus said to the Jews and what Paul says to the Gentiles.
Okay. So I think we talked a lot about that, but I'm realizing that's kind of unique to you, right?
It's not unique to me for people who really try to understand the scriptures.
Okay.
There's a guy named Les Feldick. He's a farmer, and he understands it clearly.
Okay.
And I don't know about scholars, but I know that people who really want to know this, they know that Paul is bringing something very different to those people rather than what Yeshua and the first apostles brought. Okay,
that makes sense. I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not run my race in vain.
It's a check and balance. I just want to make sure that I'm getting some feedback on what I've been teaching, is kind of what he's saying there.
Okay. Which leads him into, yet not even Titus, who is with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he is Greek. So it's like the thing that's in question is circumcision.
Seems like it.
That he's presenting to them too.
Yeah.
So is it to say the question of circumcision is for Gentiles?
Is circumcision for Gentiles?
Or
Yes.
the question is with regard to Gentiles, like
Yeah.
not Jews, obviously.
No, Jews always believed in circumcision, but now we're bringing Gentiles in. So
Okay.
do they have to be circumcised?
But did Jews, like, did the gospel of Christ for the Jews include circumcision still?
Not it allowed it.
Okay.
Because that was part of their culture, and in the ebb and flow of these two cultures coming together, they didn't just say Jews don't get circumcised. They let them still go to their temple. There was a lot of overflow from what they did before that ultimately was going to fade away. But in that initial time, just do what you do, get circumcised. Don't eat unclean things. It's all okay. But to these Gentiles now coming in, so now they're allowed to eat unclean things and they're allowed to not be circumcised. So what did that do? It created conflict between Jewish converts and Gentile converts. And that's what one of the main reasons he wrote a letter to the church at Rome, because they were fighting with each other constantly over how to be a Christian.
Okay. So this matter arose, he continues, this matter arose because some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we had in Christ and to make us slaves.
Ooh.
We did not give in to them for a moment so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you.
Those were probably considered Judaizers, and they were false believers who had come in. They didn't really believe in the gospel. They believed in Judaism being infiltrated with the gospel and were preaching circumcision, dietary laws, things like that. Paul says we didn't give in to them for a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think you might be a little bit quiet. Sorry to interrupt, guys.
Okay.
But okay. I just felt like in that moment, though, it might be sort of a side topic, but it seems clearer with these sorts of statements that liberty, I keep trying to understand why liberty is so essential to Christianity for you. And it just was like worth pointing out there that he says, to make us slaves is the thing that's bad.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's not an obvious assumption as just a person coming into the Bible for the first time that the thing that you're trying to understand is how to get liberty. Like sometimes I wonder if that's specific to you.
No.
But it's not, or not specific to you in terms of Christianity, but specific to you in terms of what you want out of life. Like, you really want liberty.
Definitely specific to me personally.
Yeah.
And that's why I found so much hope and solace and guidance in a true understanding of the gospel, because it does bring liberty. If it doesn't, then it's not the good news. So right here, Paul's just saying, we didn't do anything they said. No Sabbath day, none of these rules, right? Well, churches impose rules. So when they do that, they are stripping your liberty. Paul says it right there. Even commanding someone to be circumcised is taking their liberty away from them. And he stands for that liberty that we should have, meaning it's no more of any of these acts. It's none of it. And churches will not accept that. They'll use the word tithe. And that imposes on the liberty of a cheerful giver, and so that's what we stand for in the ministry, is absolute liberty to believe what you want. And that is upholding what I think Christ died for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like the previous episodes in the first chapter of Galatians, we were talking through the Paul versus Timothy thing, and like the guy, the commenter or whatever, they want to find a way for there to be structure, like you're talking about. And he just did an interview that's really great, and you should listen to it, and we'll link it on the website. But and he talks a lot about this specifically, like structure versus unstructured, and people want that. But the existence of Paul, like all of that structure may exist in the New Testament in certain ways, but the existence of Paul doing it the other way alone, like alongside that structure, should say that.
Well, it should be an indicator that that's possible. But
Yeah.
even in Paul's day, there was a purpose for him to impose some things on the believers because Christ was coming to take that bride.
Right.
But because when Christ returned, Paul also says in the scripture that that's the end. That's the end. And we enter into a new age. That's why I don't even use Paul as an example. It's just, I use the scripture that says, no, it's over.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Just the fact that Paul got his apostleship the way he did, like all of the whole story of Paul is like, even then when there were regulations that existed.
And Paul didn't even like seek Jesus.
Yeah.
He just was walking along, killing them. It's radical, his conversion, and it brings us into a new place.
Yeah. And liberty here, he's saying those people were going to make us slaves. We didn't give in to them, so the truth might be preserved. Like liberty and the truth are connected.
Yes.
Which again, I'm trying to like not assume anything as we do this and be like, why is that the case? But it is essential in the Bible, at least, that liberty and truth are things that you want, basically.
And I don't want to put you on the spot because, you have to really study to know these things. But where does Yeshua say a statement that makes that clear? Do you know? He says,
the truth will set you free.
That's right.
Gosh, sorry.
He says, you shall know the truth will set you free. So a lie will put you in bondage. So if you find someone preaching to you tithe, Sabbath day, dress codes, dietary laws, that's a lie. And yep, no. And it's unbelievable. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just keep going. As for those who were held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism. They added nothing to my message.
Oh, he's so hardcore.
It's amazing. On the contrary, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and that they should be circumcised. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I'd been eager to do all along.
And the emphasis on the poor was because Peter and James and John, who were working among the Jews in that community, it's like being in the 1800s living here and someone in a Mormon community saying, I don't believe this church anymore. You will be cut off from everything. Just everything, money, So they were starving. So that's why the apostles said, try to remember the poor, which is what he does in different books.
Okay. Which is not the case now. You can be rich and a non-believer or poor and a believer, or whatever the inverse is. Without beating a dead horse, he's appealing to these guys. He's like trying to gain, I'm assuming he's trying to gain credibility before he like speaks to the Galatians.
Yeah.
And he started off by saying, I don't listen to anybody.
Yeah.
And now, it seems like I'm wondering if that part where he's saying, I don't listen to anybody was about like other people, but like James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars. That's what he says. He appeals to them to give himself credibility.
Yeah.
So could that be it? Like everyone in the world, he's not appealing to anybody or like getting anything from anyone except Jesus. But in terms of the Galatians, they trust these three people, and those three people trust him.
It sounds like it. And it sounds like that's wisdom.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he's not fully going on. I don't listen to Peter, and you listen to your brothers and sisters, and he was humble in that way. And so he's not just an absolute maverick.
Mm-hmm.
He does talk to them, but he goes off alone and does a lot of what he does.
And why is the name Peter and Cephas used here?
I don't know. It shouldn't be Peter.
They are
and
the
Cephas.
same person?
They're the same person. Unless there's a different Peter I'm not thinking of.
For who is outworking Peter as an apostle? Next sentence, James, Cephas, and John.
Yeah, I would imagine that it's just like sometimes you say, call me Bjorn, and sometimes you call me Shawn. I don't know.
I don't call you either of those. Oh, that's funny. Okay.
I'm pretty sure Cephas and Peter, I don't think there was another guy named Cephas walking around, is what I'm saying.
Okay. I lost my place.
Don't you hate when that happens?
Sorry. Yeah, I do. Okay, so when Cephas came to Antioch, this is kind of like a boring chapter, to be honest, because he's just setting the stage for what he's going to say to them. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. So he's saying they approved of him. Now he's saying he opposed him. For because certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself with the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in hypocrisy, so that their hypocrisy, even Barnabas, was led astray.
So straight up, Paul says, you're a phony, Peter. Peter had a problem with fearing certain things. It's so funny, too, because he was supposed to be the biggest of the apostles. And he also did things that seemed rather bold, like cutting off the ear of Malchus when they took Jesus from Gethsemane. He took a sword and he cut off his ear. But, here you see him being a coward of what? The culture. The Jews terrified him because they were putting people to death. So he was like, I don't eat with the Gentiles. Paul calls him out straight up. Love that.
Yeah. I also thought it seemed like the nature of the apostles' work was specifically to set them apart from the Jews, to set themselves apart from the Jews. That was the purpose of what they were doing. Would you say?
It was to set them apart in terms of, yes, they were bringing forth the new gospel of Jesus Christ. They were still Jews, but they were set apart to witness of his resurrection. And Peter got mixed up in the cultural application of that. And the eating was so big with Peter, because we remember when he goes to Cornelius, he's the one where a net comes down from heaven and God says, rise, eat, kill, and eat. And he says, not going to do it to God.
Oh my gosh.
And God says, don't tell me, So even here is another, he has a little thorn in his side. If I'm like any apostle, it's probably Peter.
Really?
Yeah, because, I mean, he's impetuous. Especially when I was younger, you step out and you want to do things boldly, but then you find yourself embarrassed. No. So, but that is a beautiful thing. That's what God called him. He knew who he was calling.
My favorite thing, I think one of my favorite things about you, just as the role of a Bible teacher, is the personality. You're able to siphon out personality from the very little we have on these people, and just the stories you read them with such spirit.
Oh, I love them.
It's really sweet. It changes it. It makes it fun to learn about.
Yeah, we don't have much about anybody else. No. John, Peter, and
But even like Old Testament,
Oh,
like
those
people have
guys
such
kill
a
me.
hard time reading that stuff, and you're making a full-on comedy out of it.
And I'm probably wrong, and they're going to all be standing there when I die. What?
That's so funny. Well, we're at 20 minutes, but that part, I wanted to make the point, and I'm not remembering the point, but let me read what I wrote. It seems like the nature of the apostles' work is set to set themselves apart from the Jews. The main distinguisher is working through the law versus faith.
Yeah.
So Paul is saying here that Cephas started out not caring about the laws like circumcision, but that the fear of the law started to creep in again, or culture, or whatever it is. And I just mentioned that it makes no sense today that we try to set ourselves apart from just unbelievers and that we're allies with Jews. Like Christians are kind of allies with Jews
Big
right
time.
now, right?
Big time.
Like the whole way that Christianity's done with and according to Judah, like Christians, their main focus right now is to set themselves apart from non-believers, not from Jews.
No, they align themselves spiritually with Jews. Yeah, and it's because the Jews in the Old Testament, God says, those who are on your side, I'm with. Those who are against you, I will destroy. So, but that's Old Testament.
But like this, like Paul calls out Cephas for associating with the Jews.
He calls out Cephas for his hypocrisy in his associating with them.
Okay.
Meaning he wouldn't eat unclean food in front of them. He would eat unclean food with the Gentiles. But it's funny because...
Yeah, but then what's the become all things to all people?
Yeah, and Paul teaches that. So, and he says, I become all things to all men that I might gain some. So apparently there was some sort of real hypocrisy in that instead of just the action of becoming more like your audience.
And this sort of thing is why you will say the Bible contradicts itself all the time.
Yeah.
Like I haven't known the Bible enough to know where that happens.
Things
and
like
that
this.
seems like one of them.
So we have to read into then why there's that contradiction. And that's where we don't know. So you can say, well, it's not a contradiction because we don't know. But when we read it, that's a contradiction. Yeah.
For sure. That's like, it's not a contradiction if you read it by the spirit that you're talking about, which is the principle. There's a real hypocrisy. There's a not, but like in terms of the way other people read into things right now, they're saying you don't do both, and you do both. Yeah.
Before we wrap up, I know we've gone long, but I do want to say something, and I've said it before, but it's really, really important. And that is, we have as much love for people who call themselves Jews as anybody else, today. That's just all there is to it. And culturally, I love the Jewish culture. And the people, I find them very intelligent and as a people. And so it's nothing anti-Semitic. But if we really want to look at them, then we have to look at God got fed up with them. God destroyed them, and he disseminated them out into the world in 70 AD. And then finally in 134, that was it. They were dispersed. They don't have their genealogy. They don't even know who's a Jew anymore. Okay, so we don't know who a Jew is. So this allegiance of Christians to Judaism and Israel is completely stupid. Add in that they are the biggest haters of Christ. Hate him, okay? As compared to a Muslim who recognized Christ, not as a Messiah, but as a prophet. And others, they hate him more, and they have done more to destroy Christianity through their translation of the Old Testament. So when you start holding Jews up as people to affiliate with, you're stupid. It's not anti-Semitic, but religiously, the reason it works here in America is because to be pro-Israel, that's where your eschatology comes in, because if he's coming back to save Israel, we want to be on that side. It's a little bit of a rant, and it's a little politicized, but I don't mean it to be.
No, I see what you're saying. Yeah. it comes down to eschatology then.
Yeah.
Like it really hinges on that. I'm trying to think through like if he didn't return,
Oh, if he didn't
what would
return,
be the what would we be doing right now with Jews?
we should be affiliated with them because he's coming back to the Mount of Olives and he's coming to gather up his own. So it's going to be Jews and Gentiles at that time.
But like this, for instance, like there was a separate gospel.
Yeah.
Like maybe that's what I was trying to ask. Like what was Paul doing? What were Gentiles doing at that time? Like were they trying to... It seemed like Jews who reject Christ were one pool of people, Jews who accept Christ are another, and then Gentiles who accept Christ.
Yeah.
So the Jews who accept Christ and then Gentiles who accept Christ, it seemed like both of them were trying to be distinguished from the Jews who reject Christ, right?
They were both being distinguished from the Jews who rejected Christ, but the Gentiles probably didn't care much because they were just of another faith.
Okay.
Yeah. The Jews who converted to Christ definitely wanted to separate from the Jews who didn't accept him.
Okay. And so just like by nature, the Gentiles would probably not be associating with Jews who reject Christ.
Probably not. Just like Christians today don't associate with people who reject Christ, you know.
Right. But I guess I'm trying to get to like why, like, is it just that single verse? Like, why was that the case in the New Testament time if the call in the Old Testament was to be on their side? Like you're saying you'd be on the side of those people when the time comes or whatever.
Yeah.
Like if that was what was asked, why was there some sort of setting apart that happened?
Because that Paul clearly understood that the people who put Christ to death were not Jews really. They were just Jews by name. He talks about how just because you're circumcised doesn't make you a Jew. Just because you come from this heritage doesn't make you a Jew. True Israel are Israel in the heart. So he makes that distinction. And for those who didn't receive Christ, he was hard on them because they put him to death. They were utterly corrupted by the time Yeshua came to earth. The Jewish nation was corrupt and vicious and brutal. There were some of it that were true, and that's who Christ came to call and bring out.
Who is anyone supposed to be on the side of? What is that verse in the Old Testament that justifies people supporting Israel right now?
It's in Deuteronomy, and I think it's in Numbers, and it's because at that time the nation was going through into the promised land, and they were meeting all these different giants and tribes and stuff. So God says, "Those who are against you are against me. I will fight for you. I will." So we take those passages and assign them to today.
Okay.
They have no bearing.
It's really early Old Testament.
Really early.
It wasn't even applicable to the people at Jesus' time.
No, because they had fully left God.
Okay, so like
He divorced
it's not
them
even,
in Jeremiah.
So even if Jesus hasn't returned, that is not an applicable principle.
It's not, but because he's coming back to take his own and is going to land on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, that's the tie. We can't let other nations destroy Israel because Jesus is coming back to that place. We need to be supportive of that place. It's all stupid. It really doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, none of it makes sense.
Yeah. But please don't take it as anti-Semitic.
I don't think the other side makes sense either. It's not like you're making a political statement here.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for making that point.
Thank you.
On to the next
for accepting
episode.
that point, hearing it.
Goodbye.
Bye.